Laura, it's nice to see you again. And I'm really glad that we've got a pretty good turnout for today's presentation. So I'm going to be talking to you today about job demand assessments and kind of developing and more so how to use job demand assessments, because there's so many different templates that are available, tons of pros and cons to each and every single one, honestly. And we're going to be talking about all of those things. So I do really welcome questions and feedback. Rob will moderate the chat and let me know. So what we are going to do is we're going to talk about what a job demand assessment is, some of the typical contents of a job demand assessment, how data collection is completed, who writes the job demand assessment. We'll talk about just that variety of templates that exist, pros and cons for each of them, which might help your organization if you're thinking of kickstarting some job demand assessments. And if you're also looking for reasons to bring job demand assessments into your workplace, I'm going to be talking about the multitude of ways that these job demand assessments can be used, because there is an exhaustive list, and it's one of my favorite topics. So I'm going to try and hold back. I'm going to try and stay on topic, but we've got a lot of things to cover. So a job analysis is essentially a systematic method of collecting, evaluating, and documenting information about a job. These are done objectively to represent the skills and abilities that are required to complete the job. I try to make this process as objective as possible, because these job demand assessments are used in so many different ways. In order for them to be useful, they really need to be objective. Tasks that are required need to be indicated that they're essential duties. If tasks are non-essential, then they need to be documented as non-essential. This is really important for returning people back to work following an injury, or keeping people at work during claims. It's so important. There's so many different aspects. We're going to go through quite a few different terms. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So you've got kind of an occupation, which is usually a title that is pretty general and broad. And you might have a few different jobs that fall within one generalized occupation. And then within each task, or within each job, you've got tasks. Some tasks are similar between jobs and some are pretty different. So to illustrate this point, I'm going to use a gardener example. So you might have a job as a gardener, or an occupation as a gardener in your municipality. And maybe within the gardening department, let's pretend you have two different jobs, two different gardening jobs. So your junior gardener is represented by an asterisk when we're talking about tasks. The senior gardener is represented by a smiley face when we're talking about the different tasks. So you can see when we do a task breakdown, for this example, I literally just kind of pulled out of the air. Some of the similar common tasks between the two, they would be planting trees, pruning bushes, probably fertilizing. Depending on a lot of things, they might be driving between locations, or they might be hired to complete their work at one specific location. So that's really important to differentiate. And another task that usually falls on the more senior person might be scheduling. So we've got somebody who's involved with scheduling. We are going to come back to this slide later. Scheduling is usually completed by people in more senior roles due to experience, enhanced decision-making, qualifications, capabilities, and so then that will change there. Sorry about that. Okay, so some other related terminology that we're going to go through is a PDA, commonly known as a physical demands assessment. I've also heard the term PDD, a physical demands description. So we've got these two. I kind of group them together because these are very, very similar when I've seen them documented. Most of the time they are relating to the physical aspects of what's required in a job. The word assessment often leads people to think that there's some kind of an evaluation associated with it, and sometimes there is a ranking in different portions. Physical demands description, the people who write these typically emphasize the fact that these are the demands required in the job, not saying anything's good, not saying anything's bad, this is just how it is. So PDAs and PDDs are frequently used interchangeably. A CDA is a cognitive demands assessment. The cognitive demands assessment typically looks at decision-making and thinking required to complete a job. Sometimes somebody who writes a job demand assessment will incorporate elements of a cognitive demand assessment and a physical demand assessment in the same document. So if you are in charge of the organization's documentation, you might, be really interested in having documentation on physical demands only. You might be interested in cognitive demands only, or if you're interested in having both, then you probably want a template that includes both. So just make sure that you know what you're asking for, make sure you know what you have. I've also heard what I refer to as a job demand assessment. I've also heard that referred to as a PCDA, so a physical and cognitive demands assessment. I typically use those two terms, PCDA and JDA, interchangeably because to my knowledge, they are very similar. The physical and cognitive demands assessments, when people have promoted that, it's basically just to make things very clear that what the person is getting is going to be looking at both of those. I'm going to be using the term JDA for this presentation because that's what I'm familiar with. That's what I always go back for. And my job demand assessments look at all of the aspects of the job. So strength, mobility, postural demands, all of those things that you would find in a physical demands assessment, but they also look at cognitive demands. So behavioral, psychosocial, sensory demands, you're going to find all of those in there. So this is the first of several templates that we're just going to look through. So this one, if you're in Alberta, then you will probably be, if you're in safety in Alberta, I guess, you have probably seen this document before. This is the WCB Alberta's physical demand assessment form that you can find online. I've just screenshotted some excerpts here just for discussion. So the WCB Alberta physical demands assessment analysis, you can enter things online if you want and save it. Some of the key pieces that they pull out here is job title, company name, frequency of how often different physical, or I guess manual handling tasks in this case, are completed. So in this format, how it is completed is you kind of look at the job as a whole. It isn't necessarily broken down into elements within the job. It's looking at, okay, we are a gardener. What do we do as gardeners? When are we doing low-level lifting? So it looks at the physical demand and kind of highlights all of the things that you would do if it's low level. I would consider low level to be anything below the waist. Waist level lifting would be near the waist. So probably knuckle height to about chest height. And when we're looking at above shoulder lifting, that's going to be at shoulder. level and above, of course, but one thing I always like to differentiate when I'm completing a template such as this is to define numbers for what shoulder is. I'm 5'8". My shoulder height is going to be different from somebody who's 4'10". It's also going to be very different from somebody who is 6'7". So typically, if I'm completing a form like this, I like to make sure that I'm highlighting some of those items that I believe are definitely qualify as being below waist. But I like to put in numbers as well. So shelf heights, maybe there's a range of shelf heights. Maybe there's a range of vehicles that people are taking materials in and out of. Closing a trunk door, it's probably always going to be above shoulder height. Maybe if there's one type of vehicle that people use, you can put in the number for what that height is for pulling down that trunk door. So try to use numbers. I try to use numbers as often as possible just to go along with these postures, because it's really important to consider the user for who's going to be using this document afterwards. What kind of information they will find useful, how they're using it for claims management, to deny a case or to accept a claim, or if they're trying to find opportunities for modified work for somebody. So physical demands assessments and analyses often look at mobility. They look at strength, so manual handling demands. They also look at mobility and positional tasks. So are you climbing up and down stairs? Are you climbing a vertical ladder? Are you climbing inside? Are you climbing outside? If you're doing things outside, you need to consider all of those environmental variables that we also see. So on one of the other pages for the PDA form for WCB Alberta, since these are usually used for physical claims and often for back claims and, second most frequent shoulder claims, heavy items are usually flagged. So it's good to know what is being lifted, what is heavy. I often start off jobs by asking people, when I'm breaking things down, I do ask, what's the heaviest thing you handle? How often do you handle that? Oh, once every year. Okay, that's good to know. All right, what's the second heaviest thing that you handle? Oh, another object, and you do this daily. Perfect, good to know. Or if they're doing something several times a day, that's really important to know. We'll get into frequencies after. But I like to get people thinking about their jobs and how they do it. It's also important to recognize that many different templates, including the WCB template, highlight force demands and give that a certain ranking. So, limited it's a protected standard. So I know that if somebody is doing limited lifting, then they're lifting less than 11 pounds. If it's light work, it's going to be less than 22 pounds. Medium demand is less than 44 pounds. Heavy, it's going to be 44 pounds and higher. So I kind of have those limits in my head. So if a healthcare provider is asking for somebody to, be accommodated in a job and they don't want any lifting, it's going back to the healthcare provider and asking them, okay, well, what do you mean by no lifting? Do you mean, items that weigh more than 5 pounds, items that weigh more than 10 pounds? What are we talking about? These different criteria really help a conversation and give people starting points and have people thinking about the tasks that are required to do the jobs and what is essential and what is non-essential, what can be modified, what cannot be modified. Okay. So when you're looking at different templates, and I've just shown you one so far, it's really important to think about the needs for your organization. I'm not sure if any of you participating today have job demand assessments already, or if you're looking at bringing some in. So if you're looking at bringing some in because you've never done them before, really consider the needs of your organization. How are these job demand assessments going to be used? Maybe you're an organization that has job demand assessments already, but maybe they're not quite fitting your needs. So a good starting point is to look at what you do have and finding those gaps. Finding out who's using them, finding out who would use them if they incorporated, a note about tools and material and equipment that's used, or maybe PPE. Maybe they'd use them more if they had information on cognitive demands. Maybe you're in an organization that has a ton of office style work, but the people doing that office style work need to be thinking about a lot of different things. Maybe there's a lot of concussions, and maybe you're trying to help figure out how to accommodate concussions. Some organizations want JDAs completed so that they can check a box. I have a few clients over the years who have just wanted to have a full binder of all the jobs, whether they use these job demand assessments or not. They just want a starting point. They want brief job demand assessments completed for every single job in the facility, so that if they have an incident, if it's a work-related incident, if it's a non-work-related incident, they at least have a starting point to go back to and say, oh, you know what? You've had a concussion and you're doing this job. Let's see what kinds of work demands might be more challenging for you to come back from, and especially considering documentation that your physician has provided. Let's look at the restrictions your physician has provided. Let's see how those match to the demands that are required in your job and the demands that are not required in your job, and we'll just see what we can do with that. I have some clients who look at them, and when they're looking at, if somebody's received a driving under the influence ticket and they've had their license taken away, if you have a job where somebody is required to drive, like a bus operator, for example, they likely won't be able to be accommodated back in their job until they're allowed to drive again legally. But if driving is a non-essential component, then that's fine. They can probably come back, whether or not they are not allowed to drive, as long as they can get themselves to where they are. So find out if you're just using them to kind of check a box, or what kind of level of detail needs to be in the job demand assessment. As we go through some of these examples, you'll see that some have a lot of detail and some don't have a lot of detail. I can tell you that the ones that do have a lot of detail are probably because those job demands assessments are used by multiple people within the organization. Claims management is looking at the comments section, they're looking at the frequency section, whereas somebody else, a supervisor perhaps, might be looking at, okay, what's everything that's completed above shoulder height? All I care about is what's being done above shoulder height. Or somebody else might be looking at, okay, I just care about what's lifting. They can easily find those items depending on the template you're using. In terms of claims management and different templates, there are absolutely some job demand assessments that you can find online that are very generic, that might be completely appropriate and relevant for your workplace. So if you find that, that's great. I do caution you, because it is my job. I write these for a living, so I'm pretty critical when it comes to certain details, and I just really want you to make sure that things are appropriate, that the equipment being used in the generic one is generic enough that it falls within your organization. And if things are updated in terms of layout or manpower or people interactions, that's easy to update. Many clients are looking for different ways that they can update job demands assessments easily, depending on who's using it or how the job changes, if it expands or whatnot. Can the job demand assessments be completed in-house? Absolutely, depending on the training of the people in-house that you're going to have write them. So we'll get into that a little bit more later. So I am an ergonomist. and I complete job demand assessments, I complete industrial ergonomics assessments. Sometimes things get a little bit confusing because I'm an ergonomist, and sometimes people think that if I'm coming in to do a job demand assessment, I'm also going to evaluate the job. I always like to differentiate between a job demand assessment, that a job demand assessment is describing what's physically and cognitively required to do the job. It's not saying whether something is good or bad. Usually I don't know if something's good or bad unless I've applied some guidelines to it. I can talk about ergonomics too, but an ergonomics assessment, risk assessment, will evaluate the demands against different standards and frequencies and forces and postural demands to determine an injury risk. But a job demand assessment just describes what is required to do the job. So contents of a job demand assessment. I've seen tons of different ones. And most frequently, these are the items that are in here. Some job demand assessments do not have some of the items here. For example, equipment and tools listed. That doesn't mean it's a bad document. It might just not be relevant. So these are elements that I find really helpful to be able to refer back to when I'm writing a job, when I'm assessing a job, when I'm evaluating a job. So job title, really important. If the job title falls within different departments or is part of an occupation, maybe even just highlighting some of that tree to make it obvious would be apparent, because you never know who's going to be reading these documents and what they kind of have to fill in. A job title of analyst might not be giving the reader the full information of what the job is going to entail. It's nice to have a brief job description that goes through the essential duties required in the job. That will help the reader get an idea of what they're going to be reading. It gives them a little bit of information on the tasks that are required, might give them an idea of some tasks that are sometimes completed but not required as part of the job, i.e. maybe easily accommodatable. Usually there's a task list. If it's a task-based JDA, some JDAs are just job-based, so they don't break things down by job. Once again, pros and cons to both of those. I'm used to writing with about 5 different templates, and I adapt. There's, like I said, there's pros and cons to all of them. I don't actually have a favorite template, if that's believable or not, but I do think that the right template is going to depend based on the job and the organization. Photographs, I'm pretty biased. I take a lot of photographs. I think it's really important for a job demand assessment to include photographs, because many readers don't like to read all the words. Many readers, depending on if they're claims management, an insurance company, a physiotherapist, they are not going to read everything, but they might read the job title and description, and then they might flip to the page with the picture so that they can see kind of what people are doing and go, oh my gosh, oh, I didn't know they did that, or oh wow, that really puts this injury that they're coming into perspective, or oh, I know what they mean now, because I've seen some of the postures and I know why they have to bend forward. They're bending their back because things are low, not because they are choosing to bend their back, for example. Having a list of equipment and tools listed can be very helpful, depending on the organization, depending on the job. Ratings for cognitive and psychosocial demands, usually really helpful. Environmental and job demands, so that would be, for example, if they're working inside, if they're working outside, if they're working on a rotating shift, sometimes they're doing nights, sometimes they're doing days, just having a perspective, context on how they're doing that. Some talk about PPE that's required. Many all physical demands assessments and job demand assessments have an element of strength, postural, mobility demands for what's required. I think that all JDAs should list the name of the person who completed the report and their credentials, and also a date. Date is important so that you know when the information was collected, and if you have a policy of updating things every 5 years, then you kind of know what's coming up. So when preparing for data collection, this is helpful to know if you're an organization that's having somebody come in to help. So you always want the person collecting data to be coming in during a typical day. This is so important for so many different reasons. If it's a busier day than normal, or if it's a slower day than normal, it's really helpful for the analyst to know, because we look at tasks, but we also look at how frequently they're done. So if it's a very busy day, then we're probably going to be, looking at the higher range of repetitive demands, and we're going to be asking them just back and forth to verify, is this typical? Is this not typical? It's also really helpful because we want to avoid, the show and tell type jobs. So if somebody says, okay, this is what I do, and then I do this, and then I do this, well, that's really helpful for establishing a list of jobs and a list of tasks within each job, but it doesn't quite show us how the work is done. I always tell people that I went to school to watch people work, and that is what I do. I watch people work, and I watch how they do it. I look at those interactions. You may think it's boring for me, and it isn't, because I'm always looking at different things. I'm looking at the neck, I'm looking at the elbow, I'm looking at the shoulder, I'm looking at how often they're repeating, going in and out of different awkward postures. So some people might see it as, oh, I'm just a cashier, just moving things around, but I'm looking at the size of the objects that they're using. I'm looking at whether they're sitting, whether they're standing, how much they're reaching, how often they're using the button to push up the conveyor. So we are looking at lots of different things when we're analyzing jobs. It's important to look at trained workers. It's no fun to write a job demand assessment and then send it back out for validation, and then find out that the worker did the job all wrong. So my document is all wrong. So having a trained worker who's going to do the work the way they're trained to do it is really valuable for the ergonomist or the analyst, so that they know what they're watching. It's always important to talk to the supervisors before and after to let them know what you are doing and what you aren't doing, to let them know that you're trained at this and you're going to stay out of the way as much as possible. You're going to stay back, collect questions in your head or write them on notes, and then ask questions if needed in between pauses of work, or if it's not appropriate to ask the individual because they are just too busy. You might be asking the supervisor just for some clarification, and then confirming with the worker during a pause. Supervisors are usually the ones reviewing the job demand assessments afterward to validate that it's accurate, and providing it to their workers as well, so that they have feedback to be able to say, yeah, you know what, this is accurate, this is what I did, or you know what, the person who is in, they missed these things, and these are really important elements that should be in the document, so we should add these in. That's super valuable. If I'm writing a job demand assessment, I want to know that the document that I'm writing is useful. Depending on the workplace, you may find it helpful to meet with the union, Joint Health and Safety Committee, HR, or maintenance. Not every single time you're coming in to do job demand assessments, but certainly for a kickoff, it's usually pretty helpful. I always make sure I get permission to take photographs by anyone who needs it. Sometimes I go into a place with a lot of security, and it's just photos are a no-go. So then it's trying to mock things up afterwards in a safe place, and also getting permission to take people's photographs and show them to them. Most importantly, I think it's important to explain the purpose of the job demand assessment to the workers, and how it will be used and how it won't be used. And it's, more often than not, it's to keep people at work, keep them safe, and bring them back to work if they get injured, or try and find modifications. So these are tools that are frequently used during job demand assessment data collection. On the top left, I've got a flashlight and gloves, because I don't like getting my hands dirty. And sometimes I don't like to just touch things that are being used by others. Bottom left is a scale used to weigh items. There's also a camera and a kneeling pad if I'm looking at low items, because I want to try and practice what I preach as well. The rest of the items on the top, we've got a force gauge. That's the white dial with the push meter and the hook on the end, that can push and pull to determine those forces in those directions. I've got some strapping in that image as well that I use to extend it if I need to secure the item to measure the forces on a cart, for example. We've got a pinch gauge so that you can do force matching to simulate the force demands required in pinching. I also use a clipboard so that I have a hard surface for writing all of my notes and completing data collection. Pens and pencils are great for writing with. Always have a pencil close by, because if I'm going into a cold environment or cold outside, my pen won't work. So pencils are always great. Measuring tape, I measure everything. The analyst doing a job demand assessment should measure everything. Reach distances, hand heights, things that are blocking the worker, dimensions that they're handling, all of that is very, very important. On the bottom right, we've got a hand grip dynamometer also used for measuring grip demands, okay? So who writes job demand assessments? This answer is, can be kind of controversial in some circles, and this topic often comes up as a gray area. I try to make it pretty black and white, mostly because this is what I do for a living, and I've worked really hard to do what I do. So certified ergonomists are absolutely qualified to be doing job demand assessments. We go through extensive training and a rigorous certification procedure to become certified. Canadian Certified Professional Ergonomists is the only credential in Canada that's recognized by the International Ergonomics Association. And so that is the certification that should be sought by somebody who's looking to do ergonomic services. There are other trained analysts who have been trained to be able to do job demand assessments. I can't talk about which programs or anything, because mostly because I'm not super familiar with those, but I do know that there are people who are trained. If you are, sorry about that. I know that the occupational health and safety clinics in Ontario does specifically come out to say that if the worker or the consultant completing a job demand assessment isn't a Canadian Certified Professional Ergonomist, then make sure that they have appropriate training in conducting the PDDs. Training should include elements on task analysis, observation, measurement, data collection, photography, video recording for job demand assessments, and appropriate training. So appropriate training is one of those terms that just keeps coming up, because every once in a while I do look up, like, who should be doing these anyway? And so trained analyst is what comes up most often. So I do encourage you that if you are looking to develop job demand assessments in your workplace, that you seek somebody who's a certified ergonomist, especially for those jobs that are complex or maybe contentious. And if you have questions on that, we can talk about it. I do try to stay as objective as possible. And I know that there's other trained analysts who are not certified ergonomists who probably do a very good job at writing job demand assessments. But the certification is there for a reason. So that's kind of where I'll stop with that. But look out for a certified ergonomist, and if not a certified ergonomist, make sure that you're very comfortable with the training that they have. Frequency of demands is the next thing I want to talk about. So on job demand assessments, we look at force demands, we look at postural demands, we also look at frequency. So there's usually some kind of rating, and the ratings that we see most often are rare, occasional, frequent, constant. There are tables that you can find that can assign a minutes rating to this, depending on, if it's a 4-day workday, 8-hour, which is typical, or 12 hours. So I put that here for context. Workers' Compensation Board, Alberta uses these recommendations, which are the same ones that the Dictionary of Occupational Titles uses, which is kind of the standard. I do often go back to this because some people will say, hey, I think I do this constantly, one particular task constantly. And I say, okay, so constantly means that if it's for an 8-hour day, you're doing it for more than 5.5 hours per day. Are you doing this for more than 5.5 hours per day? And if you add up the minutes, it might not be. It might feel like all day, but it might actually be an hour and a half. So going back and forth between those frequency demands are really important. We're going to go back to this gardener job very briefly. So if we're looking at the junior gardener and senior gardener, for example, we're going to go back to scheduling. So if the senior gardener is in charge of scheduling, they have an extra task on their plate. So their job demand assessment will probably look a little bit different from the junior gardeners because they will have an additional task, but they will also be spending less time planting trees, pruning bushes, fertilizing, and things like that. So whereas the junior gardener might have frequent as a rating for many different tasks, the respective senior gardener might actually be at occasional for some other tasks. Also just going to briefly talk about essential and non-essential tasks here, because with the gardener, depending on where this job is located, if it's for one particular facility and they need to get themselves there in the morning and they have to get themselves back at the end of the day, then driving is probably not an essential part of the job. But if you are spending half an hour at one location in the city, another hour at another spot, and you have to move between the two, and you are assigned one truck, you're not paired up with somebody else, then that driving might actually be an essential duty. And it is really important to differentiate between those, especially for claims management. So we're going to briefly go through one more job style here, reporting style here. So I've got kind of a lifeguard job that I did kind of mock up. So some of the things that I'm looking for are the time demands, and this relates back to figuring out how much time is spent, so we can look at the frequencies, and also looking at what's required in terms of the different jobs. So with this job that I selected, maintenance for this particular position is a requirement. It's not optional. And the job description does indicate that maintenance is required. Okay. So I talked about some of these national occupational classifications for strength already. And this is just a table to look at. So if you're looking at a job demand assessment and you're concerned about mobility demands, maybe somebody broke their ankle, they twisted their knee, maybe they're waiting for surgery for a knee injury, maybe they're coming back from an injury. Mobility is a pretty big one. So trying to find out, what kind of walking is required, what kind of climbing is required, if crawling or kneeling specifically is required. Being able to find that quickly in a job demand assessment is, or report is helpful. And then finding out which tasks it's relevant for. And if you've got a template that allows for comments, those comments might help claims management quite a bit in determining whether something, whether a claim can be accepted or denied, or whether modifications can be made to keep that employee at work. Postural considerations, you might look at full body postures. How much standing is required? What kind of standing is required? Are they standing on a mat? Are they standing on a concrete floor? Are they standing still? Are they kind of moving their arms all the time? Do they have the option between sitting and standing? If they're sitting, are they in an office chair? Are they on a stool? Does the stool have back support? Are they sitting in a vehicle that is exposing them to a lot of full body vibration or jarring? Those are things that are really important to take a look at. Also, back postures. If they're bending forward, backward, twisting, also looking at where the neck is. We also want to look at lower extremity postures. What kind of crouching, kneeling, balancing is required. With the upper extremity, we want to know about whenever the elbows are moving away from the body, what kind of postures, what is required in the job to make somebody need to reach behind them or above them. And pictures come in handy in so many different ways. So I've got a selection of pictures here. I chose these ones for this slide because they're really cool pictures, but they're not really my favorite for a job demand assessment. And it's because you can't really see the side view. I find I can't really see exactly what the back is doing, exactly what the shoulder's doing. In some cases, I can't see the face. So I like to look at pictures from the side. I think if you're comparing the picture on the left to the picture on the right here, you can see that you can look at back angles, you can look at neck angles, you can look at shoulder angles. You really get more of a picture of what kind of requirements what kind of demands are required of the worker in the photo on the right compared to the one on the left. In the photo on the left, you can see that they're reaching forward, but you don't know what else is going on. Same with these pictures. The one on the left, it looks really cool. They're doing some lifting, and you know what, from this example, you can kind of see the back twisting that's required. So sometimes having a couple of different pictures to tell a story is really helpful. But if you're looking at shoulder demands, you can't really see everything that's going on. I tend to prefer side view pictures. They tell a lot of what's going on. So with material handling, I encourage your analysts to be measuring weights all of the time. I always tell people, I'm not weighing this, because I think it's risky or hazardous, but because I just need to know what it is. I like to know what things are. I like to know why people are carrying the things that they're carrying. If it's a bag, if it's a first aid kit, for example, I might indicate the items that are inside that first aid kit. Those are really helpful. If I'm doing pushing or pulling demands, I want to find out what's being exerted by the worker. Pushing and pulling can be completed while walking, and they can also be completed just stationary as arm work, like if you're doing a wrenching task. So being able to differentiate between those is very important. Sensory and psychosocial demands, these cognitive demands are frequently looked at in a cognitive demand assessment or in a job demand assessment. Some templates go into a lot of detail on what kind of visual or auditory demands might be required. So if that's something that's really important in your workplace, make sure you're looking at a template that goes into this instead of just one that says visual demands are important. If you are able to differentiate between near vision versus far vision versus whether differentiating between colors is important, that's going to be really helpful, as well as touch, smell, even a comment section on why some of those things might be important can be really helpful. A work environment. This example that I've pulled out here is from the City of Toronto template, which is widely used in many different organizations, not just municipalities, frequently in municipalities, but not always in municipalities. But they've got things set out that divided out very well for work environment demands, whether it's inside or outside. There's an occurrence rating, so spending less than 1 hour a day, spending 1 to 3 hours a day, spending more than 3 hours a day. There's no intensity rating with this. It's just kind of, is it present or is it not present? And there's an opportunity for comments here. So there's been a lot of interest over the last few years, especially, I'd say probably over the last 5 to 10 years, with having cognitive demand assessments and cognitive demand templates and incorporating those into job demand assessments. So there are many that are being used right now. I know WCBA Alberta is trialing out a template right now specific for cognitive demands, and this is an excerpt from their draft. What I really like about templates like this is that it really spells out the intensity that's required as well as the frequency. So for example, if you are completing multiple tasks, what kind of intensity is it? Everybody thinks that they're multitasking all of the time. but is it actually required in your job? And if it is required, how much of it is required? So being able for the analyst to say, completion of one task at a time with few interruptions until it's complete, and then moving on to the next task, and just being able to differentiate between that and somebody who has to actually complete multiple concurrent tasks, and they need to be managing their time, they need to be managing their judgment, maybe they're supervising people who are also doing some of those activities. Just being able to differentiate that intensity between different jobs and what's required and what's essential and what's non-essential, and the timing demands. That can really help in terms of whether you're able to bring somebody back to work on modified duties or not. So many of the cognitive demands that are listed in these cognitive demand assessment are listed here on the left. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are just the most frequent items that I find. So how do you use these job demand assessments? So I'm just conscious of the time here. And these job demand assessments can be used for so many different things. I really encourage organizations that do have job demand assessments, if you haven't looked at them recently, pull one out, and just see how appropriate it is for HR to be using, for engineering to be using, for production to be using, for claims management to be using. And if they're not using them already, find out why they aren't, because usually these job demand assessments have tons of information on job hazards. Safety often will use these job demand assessments for conducting hazard assessments internally, or if they're just reviewing the job demand assessment saying, you know what, we haven't used that piece of equipment in a really long time. That should come out because it's really heavy and it's not being used anymore, and we need to update this job demand assessment so that it's reflective. So just internally, safety uses them all the time. If you've got an ergonomist internally, or frequently coming in as a third party, if you're asking them to look at a job, they might ask to see if there's an existing job demand assessment they can refer to, just so that they are familiar with what's required in the job. Human resources uses these for returning people back to work, whether it's an occupational injury or non-occupational injury. If they're going through claims management, if they're trying to help inform new candidates, if you're working for one or in an organization already, and you're kind of looking at another job within and kind of think you might be interested, HR might be able to say, hey, you know what? It is a really cool job, but they're expected to work nights. It's not going to work for you. There's a lot of shift work, or, this job is 50% outside in the winter during terrible conditions. Are you okay with that? So it can kind of help inform new candidates or people who are thinking of moving around. It can help supervisors, managers, and HR just find opportunities for modified work for existing employees, just to keep them back. I worked in one location where engineering was constantly referring back to job demand assessments because they wanted to be able to see the impact of, a new conveyor belt, or taking away a conveyor belt, or, adding or taking away adding or taking away some of the workers' footprints and how that would impact them. And then externally, there's tons of people who can be looking at them. I know some organizations have summary sheets that they provide for external viewers, and some give them the entire document. So it could be insurance providers, just like to have them on hand in case they need to refer back. In that case, it's really important that they are kept up to date and current and accurate. So if they're saying, you know what, we're really concerned about the weight of this first aid kit, then the weight of the first aid kit is still the weight of the first aid kit. Maybe it's 35 pounds. Maybe you took something out and now it's 15 pounds. Maybe you divided it in half, but took some things out and now it's two bins of 10 pounds each. Who knows? Family physicians, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, sometimes they look at these job demand assessments because then they get a picture for exactly how their patient may have injured themselves, and how the medical restrictions that they're going to be providing to their patient, how that might affect them afterward. I like for kinesiologists or trainers to be looking at the physical demands of what's going on. If you've got an employee who needs to be able to lift a certain amount, and they've been cleared by their physio to return to work full time, but the physio doesn't know that they're constantly hand bombing 100-pound boxes, then it might be helpful for them to be getting some assistance. So there's also different markers on when to update a JDA. So some different markers that I've put in here is if you just look at the data on the JDA and you say, oh, that's 5 years old, or that's 3 years old, or that's 10 years old. Whatever interval you decide is what makes it current, that might be your flag. You might also change it if a piece of machinery goes away or a new piece of machinery comes in. You're adding or removing different tools. You're changing the workstation layout. If you're adding new people to help out, or if you're taking people away, something that used to be divided between 4 people is now done by 1 person by themselves. That reorganization should be reflected in the job demand assessment so that people know how to manage it. So this, I've tried to talk a lot about one of my favorite topics, like I said. So I'm really pleased that I've ended with 6 minutes left for